Hi, today I'm going to talk about dynamically orthodox and unorthodox physics, the one experiment, and N theory. So the work that I'm going to talk about today began as an inquiry into the relationship between matter and consciousness, specifically to start with the relationship between the brain and personal consciousness. Now, because consciousness is hard to define, I then focused in on conscious experience, or what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness. And because I'm interested in this relationship scientifically, I started looking at the reality settings in which we can do experiments about conscious experience. Conditions which, as the next few slides will explain, turn out to be those specific physical realities in which matter-constituted systems can report on their own qualia-valued states. So already on this slide, we've taken a journey from this abstract and potentially philosophical matter consciousness question to an information theoretic question, resolvable, at least in principle, as I'll show, by an experiment. So consciousness may be impossible to define, but conscious experience can be defined, at least in a relative manner, by contrast with what mainstream physical science already studies. For example, we can contrast this brown 3D rectangular experience of a chair with this schematic depiction of the matter chair, which participates in the creation of this experience. Now, I've shown in this black line matter chair as a sort of classical analog of the experience chair. Of course, this need not take any form at all. For example, it could exist as pure information, and however it does exist, we have to think of it in a mainstream scientific context currently as fundamentally quantum. In any case, given the contrast between the matter chair, which is studied in current mainstream physics, and experience, which isn't studied anywhere in current physics, we can introduce a new symbol class into mathematical physics for experienced objects. So if italic chair here labels or points to the matter chair, then angle brackets italic chair labels or points to the corresponding phenomenon in conscious experience. So then, focusing now on experiments in a science of experience, we note that report of conscious experience, or what we can now call angle brackets labeled phenomena, plays the role of a meter or measuring device. Report is a recording meter for conscious experience, complementing measuring apparatuses such as EEG machines, recording brain activity. Next, let's look at the proper functioning of meters. In uncontroversial classical mathematical physics, this is established by a Hamiltonian formalism. In a meter-measured system Hamiltonian description, there must be an interaction term describing a coupling between the measured property L and a degree of freedom P in the meter. So for conscious experiential report to be a scientifically reliable meter, there must be a matter-constituted degree of freedom P in the brain body, which couples with an L index degree of freedom in conscious experience, i.e. this term angle bracket sub L here. So very quickly, we get to the heart of the matter. We define a class of dynamically orthodox realities as those which can be described using fundamental entities and their properties, fundamental physical laws, angle bracket symbols, and contingent conditions for the arising of angle bracket labeled phenomena. Now, perhaps you can see this already. This dynamically orthodox physics includes not only current mainstream physical theory, but also, crucially, every future evolution of physical theory that takes the same current structural form. And the key issue with the definition here is the kind of causality, or more constructively, information transfer, which can occur. So this definition here uses a carefully worked out construction called e-causality due to David Gamez. And roughly speaking, under dynamically orthodox physics, if strong emergence does occur, which must be current physics theory of conscious experience, strongly emergent properties can't have downward coupling or causation to fundamental entities. So crucially for conscious experiential science then, qualia valued information can't couple with matter states or brain states. Now, almost trivially then, once we've set things up in this way, it follows that there can't be conscious experiential science under dynamically orthodox physics, because the Hamiltonian condition for a report to be a reliable meter for conscious experience can't be satisfied, so there can't be any experiments. And with a bit of surrounding content to support reasoning, this result becomes theorem 1 in the True Consciousness Science paper, which you can find on SciArXiv or the Center for Dialogue in Science website. Now, a couple of quick things about this result. So first, this doesn't mean that we can't have a so-called materialist theory of conscious experience. In fact, these C conditions in dynamically orthodox physics can be interpreted as a hypothesis relating matter states to experiential states. It's just that we can't test them experimentally under dynamical orthodoxy. Equally, though, we can't test them under dynamically orthodox idealism. So this is not about the substance, it's about the information transfer dynamics to support experiments. Now, secondly, this issue has been massively overlooked because people subjectively believe it's absolutely obvious and completely unquestionable that report is a reliable meter. So if I ask you what's here, you'll say blueness, and most people are absolutely sure experiential blueness itself was involved in driving that report. But theorem 1 shows that you can't logically have a simultaneous commitment to dynamically orthodox physics and participation of experiential blueness in report. So almost trivially again, we can define strongly dynamically unorthodox physics as describing those realities in which every qualia value degree of freedom can, at least in principle, couple with a human brain. So if SDUP applies, we can't prove there's no experimental science, because we can't argue that the meter Hamiltonian term is forbidden by the very structure of physics. So then we have this split. Experiments about conscious experience are ruled out or not ruled out according to whether reality is dynamically orthodox or unorthodox. So which is it? What sort of reality do we inhabit? And subjective intuition, again, suggests that qualia valued report is reliable, which implies reality is dynamically unorthodox. But again, dynamical unorthodoxy is a structural revision to physical theory, so subjective intuition won't be enough. We need an experiment. And so fortunately there is one, what I call the one experiment, because it's the one in conscious experiential science which determines whether any of the other experiments are methodologically viable. So simply, in an ideal form anyway, this experiment performs a detailed comparison between actual brain dynamics of a conscious human with an orthodox dynamical simulation of those same brain dynamics. Then, subject to the same sorts of technical obstacles that any experiment really worth doing has to overcome, this actual simulated comparison can reveal systematic, dynamically unorthodox components if they exist in human brain activity. And so by now we've answered all the core scientific questions that I began with. So these first two actually depend on what matter is, which is outside the scope of this talk, but not of my broader work. We can have an experimental science of conscious experience only if a matter system can report on its qualia valued property, and that requires reality to be strongly dynamically unorthodox, something that the one experiment tests for. So now let's take a quick look at how mainstream conscious experiential science will react as and when the one experiment demonstrates dynamically unorthodox brain behaviors, as it will. The first obvious move for it will be to say, well, we'll just patch up our weak emergence theories and turn them into strong emergence with downward causation. So conscious experiential science can try and patch things up in this way, but physical theory will have been hit at this point with a tectonic shift, because dynamical unorthodoxy would for the first time demonstrate new fundamental physics in a mesoscale living system rather than in high energy physics. So this then naturally evokes the final question for today. Could this patched up strong emergence with downward causation rescue mainstream conscious experiential science? To which the answer is no, because it doesn't address a host of additional theoretical problems beyond the methodological issue. problems that stem from spatial concerns, for example, locality of information transmission, from relativistic issues, and from evolutionary problems. So to highlight those failures, I developed N-theory as a dynamically unorthodox and theoretically complete hypothesis. It addresses all those issues I just mentioned. In fact, its otherwise strange looking and ad hoc features can be exactly traced to addressing those specific issues. So it achieves unorthodox dynamics by proposing that experience itself is made of dark matter and is bidirectionally connected to the conventional matter brane by another exotic matter structure. And these matter structures inhabit a 6-dimensional space. And then the experiential subspace here is further two-way coupled to some suprabrain computation, which is required to give experience an evolution-related function. So in the interest of brevity, I can refer you to chapter 8 of the book, The Science We Need, for the details of why this hypothesis takes this specific form. But maybe it starts to look less clunky when we place it into very different contexts. First, in this sketch of an experimental program for a real conscious experiential science, N-theory stands as an alternative to this downward causation mainstream patch-up, differentiable from that patch-up by 2 kinds of gravimetric test, plus a specific dynamical signature over and above vanilla dynamic unorthodoxy. And then for the second contextual insight into N-theory, let's look at a very different context. Here, we're looking at 2 complementary, non-contradictory interpretations of N-theory. So above the line is the version that we've seen. It's a sort of extended matter theory. And then below the line, we replace an allegedly solid matter realm with computational information, and we expand the conception of a passive superbrain computation into a profound deepening of base reality, into mystery, oneness, and a kind of supramaterial intelligence. And then, in this view, we can relate N-theory to Simon Dwan and Doug Matsky's work, not to say these works are part of N-theory or in some way junior to it. This is just to show how the 3 relate. So Simon's model might be an implementation of the second interpretation below the line of N-theory, and Doug's work might be like a detailed address of the physical or proto-physical basis of how this deep intelligence makes itself known and relates to allegedly material reality. Then in terms of next steps with all of this, they're really some way back from the last slide. I'd like to get 2 pivotal papers published. The True Consciousness Science paper, which contains the proof of dynamically orthodox insufficiency, and the one experiment paper that shows how to arbitrate between orthodox and unorthodox regimens. And so in an ideal world, I'd like the sort of help with that publication process, which is familiar in the mainstream academy in terms of peer critique and support, familiar in the mainstream academy, but perhaps signally lacking for those of us working at these far-flung frontiers. So it's taken me 20 years or so to get this far by myself. It'd just be really great and fun to have some scientific companions for the next phase of the journey. Thanks so much for your attention. I'll take questions here.